It had only been 3 weeks since I buried my husband, when the second blow hit me harder than the first. Grief was already swallowing me whole, and I thought the worst pain had passed. But nothing prepared me for the moment I realized my own son had turned against me. I still remember standing in the living room, clutching the photo of my late husband like a lifeline. The house smelled faintly of his cologne, a scent that made me feel like he might walk back in at any moment. But instead of comfort, I was met with something else entirely: betrayal. My son, Michael, had gathered my late husband's files and personal papers without a word. When I asked what he was doing, he brushed me aside, cold and dismissive, telling me I didn't need to worry about it. The shock of that moment left me breathless. I had leaned on Michael these past weeks, believing he would be the one to protect me, to steady me. Instead, I realized he was treating me like an obstacle. The very child I had nurtured through scraped knees, school projects, and heartbreaks was now shoving me out of the way in my own home. The sting of grief and disbelief wrapped around me like ice. At first, I wanted to believe it was grief talking through him, that maybe he was just overwhelmed like me. But the way he avoided my eyes, the way his wife Emily lingered near the doorway with her arms crossed, told me something more sinister was happening. Their expressions weren't of sadness or solidarity, they were of calculation. It was as if I no longer belonged in my own life. That night, when I sat alone in my bedroom, staring at the empty space where my husband used to sleep, the betrayal finally sank in. It wasn't just their coldness. It was the quiet way they were moving things around the house, sorting papers, whispering when they thought I wasn't listening. Something was being kept from me, something bigger than grief. I didn't know it yet, but hidden inside those files Michael had taken were the first clues to a truth far darker than I could imagine. And that was the night I realized my tragedy wasn't just losing my husband. It was discovering that the people I trusted most might be stealing from me while my heart was still raw with grief. Looking back, it feels almost impossible to reconcile the warmth of our family's beginnings with the coldness I now feel in my own home. My husband and I built everything we had from scratch. We weren't wealthy, but we worked hard, side by side, to make sure our children had every opportunity we didn't. I spent years clipping coupons, sewing clothes by hand, and taking on extra shifts at the library. Also, Michael and his sister could go to good schools and grow up without feeling the weight of our sacrifices. Our house had always been filled with noise, birthday parties, laughter spilling down the hallways, the smell of my husband's favorite chili simmering on Sunday afternoons. I remember those moments with a deep tenderness, almost as if I could still step back into them. For a long time, I thought the love and effort we poured into our family created an unshakable foundation. But over the years, subtle cracks began to appear. Michael grew older and more distant, his voice sharper, his patience shorter. Emily, his wife, never said much outright, but her silences carried judgment. I used to brush it off, telling myself they were stressed with bills or the children. But in hindsight, I see how those little dismissals and cold shoulders were warning signs. Respect, the very thing I had tried to teach them through my own example, was slowly draining away. I remember one Christmas in particular. Instead of gratitude, there were complaints, gifts not expensive enough, food not fancy enough. My efforts brushed aside with a casual indifference that stung more than any harsh words could. At the time, I told myself it was just the season's stress, but now I see it was the beginning of something darker. That unease has followed me into the present. After my husband's passing, I began to notice things around the house shifting, disappearing. At first, it was small, an old watch he had kept since his college days, a piece of jewelry my mother had left me. Then, one morning, I opened the drawer where we kept our financial documents, only to find several folders missing. My husband's will, his life insurance paperwork, even the deed to the house gone. The realization sent a chill through me. This wasn't forgetfulness or misplacement. Someone had taken them, and as much as I wanted to deny it, I already knew who it was. That was the moment when nostalgia gave way to dread, and the suspicion that had been whispering in my mind began to roar. The missing documents gnawed at me for days. At first, I tried to tell myself I must have misplaced them, but deep down, I knew better. My husband had been meticulous with his records, every paper neatly filed in labeled folders. For them to suddenly vanish, that was no accident. One sleepless night, I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. I pulled out the small lockbox we used for backup copies and discovered something that made my stomach drop. Pages had been replaced, photocopies where originals should have been, with subtle alterations that only someone familiar with our finances would catch. My name, my husband's name, even the property details were tampered with. It was like staring at a ghost version of our lives, twisted and corrupted. The more I looked, the more the truth bled through. Checks written against accounts I hadn't touched, withdrawals I never authorized, and transfers leading to an account I didn't recognize, an account in Michael's name. The weight of it pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. This wasn't just a careless mistake. This was deliberate. My son, my own flesh and blood, had been siphoning money, slowly and methodically, while I was still reeling from losing my husband. He hadn't even waited for the dust to settle before lining his own pockets. The cruelty of it stunned me. I would have given him anything he needed, but instead of asking, he chose to steal. What broke me even more was realizing Emily must have known. Her presence in the house, the way she hovered when I moved through the rooms, it wasn't just idle suspicion. She had been guarding secrets, protecting Michael's scheme. The two of them weren't simply being disrespectful. They were partners in betrayal. Just when I thought I had grasped the full extent of their deception, I uncovered something worse. A notice from an insurance company addressed to the estate of Margaret Johnson. My estate. As if I were already dead. My heart pounded as I realized Michael had submitted a fraudulent death claim, trying to cash in on a life insurance policy that was never meant to be touched until I was truly gone. In that instant, the betrayal crystallized into something undeniable. This wasn't just about missing papers or stolen heirlooms. This was fraud. This was a crime. And I knew then that silence was no longer an option. The night I found that insurance notice, I barely slept. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the weight of betrayal pressing so heavily on my chest that it felt hard to breathe. Memories of Michael as a little boy kept flashing in my mind, his first steps across the kitchen tiles. The way he used to run to me after school, with drawings clutched in his small hands. The countless nights I stayed up late helping him study for exams. I thought about the sacrifices I made, the times I went without so he wouldn't have to. Those memories should have brought me comfort. But instead, they deepened the ache. How could the same child who once held my hand so tightly now be capable of forging my death? In the morning, I moved through the house differently. My grief was still there, but beneath it, something stronger had begun to grow, a quiet fury. It wasn't the kind of anger that flares and fades. This was something deeper, steadier, like a fire that could not be put out. I had been treated like a fragile, grieving widow, someone too broken to notice the shadows moving around her. But they had underestimated me. I started to prepare, not just in my heart, but in practical ways. I gathered what papers I had left, made copies, and locked them away where I knew no one could reach them. I wrote down dates, account numbers, every detail that seemed suspicious. Years of working as an assistant at the library had taught me the value of keeping records, and now that habit felt like a shield. But the preparation wasn't only about documents, it was about me. I stood in front of the mirror and studied my reflection, the tired eyes, the lines etched by years of work and worry. For the first time in weeks, I didn't see a woman defeated by loss. I saw someone sharpening herself for a fight she never wanted, but now refused to lose. I let the suspense build, even inside myself. I didn't storm into Michael's home or demand answers right away. Instead, I watched. I listened. I waited. Every small act of theirs, every hushed conversation, every glance they shared when they thought I wasn't looking, became another piece of evidence in the case I was quietly building. They thought they were clever, that I was too weak to see through their schemes. But what they didn't realize was that grief had stripped me bare. And with nothing left to lose, I had become stronger than ever. By the time I was ready to face them, the fear was gone. In its place was a resolve I didn't know I still had. And soon, they would learn that the mother they thought they could outwit was not nearly as fragile as they believed. The day I chose to confront Michael, the house felt unnaturally still, as if it knew something was about to break. My hands trembled only once that morning, but not from fear, from the weight of carrying truth. By the time he walked through my door, I had already decided I wouldn't let my emotions control me. If I wanted justice, I needed to be steady, calm, unshakable. Michael tried to put on his usual mask, that half-hearted smile he thought could smooth over anything. But I didn't give him the chance. I laid the papers on the table, bank statements, photocopied documents, the fraudulent insurance notice with my name stamped as though I no longer existed. Each piece of evidence sat between us like stones being placed on a scale, and I could see the panic start to flicker in his eyes. For once, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't plead or ask why. I simply stated what I knew, piece by piece, like a prosecutor building her case. With every word, the balance shifted. The control he thought he had over me, over my grief, began to slip through his fingers. I watched his composure crack. He fumbled for excuses, tried to blame confusion, even hinted that Emily had pushed him into things. But his voice shook, and his hands wouldn't stay still. He had never looked smaller to me than in that moment. For the first time, he understood that I was not going to be manipulated anymore. The silence between us became its own weapon. I let it stretch, let him drown in it while I remained calm. It was a strange kind of triumph, not one I ever wanted, but one I had earned through pain. My son, who thought he held all the power, was now reduced to begging with his eyes, trying to find a way out of the trap he had built himself. But just as I thought I had reached the heart of his betrayal, another truth slipped out, one that chilled me more than the rest. in his panic. Michael admitted he wasn't acting alone. The fraudulent documents, the accounts, even the insurance scheme, they hadn't been entirely his doing. He had been working with someone else, someone who knew how to make it all look official. In that moment, the floor seemed to tilt beneath me. It wasn't just about a greedy son stealing from his grieving mother. There was a bigger danger lurking behind him, one with far more experience, far less conscience, and possibly far more to lose. I realized then that what lay ahead wasn't just a family confrontation. It was a battle against something darker, and Michael had already opened the door to it. When Michael confessed that he hadn't acted alone, I felt the air leave my lungs. I had braced myself for disappointment, for betrayal, even for anger, but nothing could have prepared me for the idea that my son had entangled me with people far beyond our family. He admitted that someone else had helped create the false documents, someone with connections and knowledge of how to make everything look airtight. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with every scrap of evidence spread before me. My grief was heavy, but the danger I now felt pressing in was heavier. If there were criminals involved, people who profited from schemes like this, then exposing Michael meant exposing them too. And criminals don't take kindly to being exposed. I had two choices: turn a blind eye and pretend I never saw the truth, or step fully into the fire and face whatever came. I chose the latter. The first thing I did was call a lawyer I had trusted for years. I explained enough for her to understand the seriousness, and she confirmed what I already suspected: insurance fraud, forged legal documents, and identity theft weren't just family betrayals. They were federal crimes. She urged me to bring the authorities in before things escalated further. For days afterward, I lived with a sense of constant unease. Every time I stepped outside, I wondered if someone was watching. Every time the phone rang with an unknown number, my pulse quickened. Michael's guilty eyes told me he knew he had dragged us all into something dangerous, but he still couldn't grasp the full weight of it. I could. When the investigators finally came, I handed over everything: copies of altered papers, bank records, even the fraudulent notice naming me as deceased. They took it seriously from the moment they saw the forged death certificate. The man behind the documents, Michael told me, went by the name of Victor. He was no family friend, no desperate acquaintance. He was someone who had been orchestrating fraud for years. My son had been just another pawn. I expected fear to paralyze me, but something else rose up instead: resolve. If Victor thought he could profit from my death, he had picked the wrong woman to cross. The weeks that followed were tense. Investigators set up surveillance, asked me to limit contact with Michael while they followed the trail. It felt like living in a movie, but the fear became bearable when I remembered what was at stake: my family's safety, my husband's legacy, and my own dignity. The breakthrough came when they traced the fake accounts back to Victor's network. One morning, I got the call arrests had been made. Victor and several associates were in custody, facing charges far larger than just what had happened to me: racketeering, wire fraud, organized crime. My evidence had been the missing link that tied it all together. When I hung up the phone, a wave of relief washed over me so strong it nearly brought me to my knees. For the first time in months, I felt safe. Michael still had to answer for his role. There was no escaping that. But in a strange way, knowing the bigger threat had been neutralized gave me room to breathe, to consider healing. I had looked real danger in the face and come out standing. And as I sat in the quiet of my kitchen, I knew one thing for certain: this battle had changed me forever. In the quiet that followed the arrests, I finally had space to breathe, to think, and to reflect. For months, my life had felt like one long storm: grief, betrayal, fear, and then the looming shadow of criminals who had seen me as nothing more than an easy target. But sitting there in my kitchen, with sunlight pouring through the window, I realized something powerful: I had survived the storm. When I think back to those early days after losing my husband, I remember how fragile I felt. I thought I was broken beyond repair. I believed I couldn't possibly endure another hardship. And yet, what came next, the betrayal by my own son, tested me in ways I didn't think I had the strength to face. But I did. That strength didn't come all at once. It built slowly, layer by layer, through small choices: choosing to see the truth, choosing to prepare instead of collapse, choosing to act instead of hide, and perhaps the most difficult choice of all: refusing to let bitterness define me. I won't pretend that everything is perfect now. Michael and I have a long road ahead, and rebuilding trust may take years, if it ever fully returns. But one thing I've learned is that love does not mean blindness. Loving your children does not mean excusing their wrongs. Sometimes the deepest act of love is holding someone accountable, even when it breaks your own heart. I also learned something about myself. For so many years, I saw myself only as a caretaker, a supporter, the one who stood behind my husband and children, making sure they had what they needed. What I discovered through this ordeal is that I am also a fighter, not in the sense of throwing punches or shouting in rage, but in the quiet, unshakable determination to protect what matters most. There is a special kind of resilience that comes with age. People sometimes mistake it for weakness, but in truth, it is one of the strongest forces there is. I may not be young anymore, but my life has taught me patience, persistence, and the power of standing firm when others expect you to bend. Justice was served. Yes. The criminals who tried to profit from my supposed death were taken down, and in helping expose them, I played a role in protecting others too. That gives me peace. But beyond the legal victories, the real resolution came from rediscovering my own worth. To anyone listening who has faced betrayal, whether by a spouse, a sibling, or even your own child, I want you to hear this: you are stronger than you think. Betrayal hurts because it comes from those closest to us, but it does not define us. What defines us is how we rise afterward, how we hold on to our dignity, and how we refuse to let someone else's cruelty strip away our humanity. If my story resonates with you, I encourage you to share your own in the comments. Your voice matters. Sometimes, speaking out is the first step toward healing, and your story might be the lifeline someone else needs. And if this journey touched you, I ask you to like this video and share it with others who may need encouragement. Because in the end, we are not just survivors of betrayal. We are proof that even in the darkest moments, light can return and hope can be rebuilt.